charging at home happens 80% of the time. Charging isn't happening at these public charging stations. And so for you to own an EV, it's almost compulsory, right, to have a way to charge your car at home.
Welcome to Multifamily Insights. I'm your host, John Casman, and I want to thank you for joining us for another great episode. Listen, if you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and review. We want to hear what you like about the show, but also let's get that feedback. I'm happy to listen to what you like, but also anything we can do to work harder for your investing goals. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. We've got a great show today. We're going to be talking to Kelsey Holshouser. Kelsey Holshouser is the co-founder and COO of Amperage Capital, an infrastructure investor and operator focused on addressing electric vehicle charging solutions in apartment communities. And in this role, she is responsible for crafting the customer experience for drivers, overseeing all construction projects, and ensuring the Amperage Capital-owned infrastructure is up and running. Let's welcome to the show, Kelsey Holshouser.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, John. I'm excited to
Hey,
be here.
absolutely, Kelsey. It's great to have you here. I went over your bio at a very high level. Why don't you take 2 minutes and fill in some of those gaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, right, co-founder and COO of Amperage Capital. My focus at the company is on that tenant experience. So if I'm renting an apartment and I own an EV, what's it like to charge my car? And so as a company, we're focused on this problem from a few angles. So we're looking at financing, right, and implementation of chargers and even getting enough power to the building. But it all started kind of on that experience side of things. And my background might be a bit different from other folks who've had on the show. I focused my career on customer experience, mostly in the tech space and always in startup world. And I ended up focusing here kind of by meandering a little bit. I had no clue what I wanted to do when I graduated, from school. But I knew that I wanted to be part of a team, because that's just what I had known my whole life. I played water polo all the way through college, so always just had a team around. And so for me, being part of a team when I got into kind of the professional sense meant joining small companies, right? Where you really feel like you're in it together, trying to solve big problems. And it was kind of in the right place in the Bay Area to be able to do that.
I
Um,
love it. I love it. Ironically, you're like the second water polo player we've had on the show in the last 4 to 6 weeks. So it's I don't know, I might have to go pick up water polo or something like that.
we're a
But
small but mighty crowd, I would
I
say.
love it.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I love the fact that you mentioned, kind of what the company is focused on, how you're focused on really that driver slash resident experience and helping to bring that to life. And this is something that's a growing trend, right? It's something that we have to pay more attention to, particularly in those class A places or, when you are, working or renting to residents who are leaning more towards those EV type vehicles. Again, we're talking about our Teslas, our electric vehicles, and all of that. For those folks who maybe aren't as familiar with this landscape and the trajectory of this landscape at a very high level, just talk about kind of where EVs are today, maybe compared to where they were, say, 5 years ago, and what the projection is 10 years out.
Yeah. I mean, our belief, right, is that this mass adoption of EVs is going to happen in the near term, right? And as it pertains to like multifamily building owners, like owners are going to need to have solutions in place for charging, right? And for even having enough power to charge EVs. Um, and so, when you look back even, gosh, like 3 years ago, EV sales, as a percent of new car sales were not super high, right? But last year, right, if we're looking at California, EVs, both battery only and plug-in hybrids, made up 20% of new car sales there. And so whether as an individual you want it or not, right? Some people are very against the change. We're on this path where EVs are going to be ruling the road in the next 10 years and sooner in some areas. And so to that end, right, there's this point in the future, if not right now, where apartment owners are going to be compelled to address charging at their buildings, right? And a big part of that is because one of the biggest benefits of driving an EV is the charging experience, right? We know from surveys and studies that charging at home happens 80% of the time. Charging isn't happening at these public charging stations. And so for you to own an EV, it's almost compulsory, right, to have a way to charge your car at home.
Yeah, I think that's really key to understand is that this is not just like a little fad or a little, blip that's happening here because we are starting to see the growth and a trajectory. You talked about, in California at least last year, 20% of all car sales were EV vehicles. And that's something that is really important to understand. And then, you may be following some of the news, but a lot of manufacturers are making that transition or on that course to make the transition. GM, has announced that they plan to be all electric, by 2035. So that's something that they are working towards as well. The point is that as apartment owners, we need to kind of get in front of this because this is something that our residents are going to be pushing for more and more in the coming future. So how do we do that? And you talked about the charging at home. Most of the charging does take place at home, not necessarily when you're at the grocery store or some other random place while you're out. So being able to either a retrofit or build communities where this is a part of it, it's going to be really important for real estate investors moving forward. So
That's right.
talk to us about kind of your focus, right? I know that you kind of have a demographic as far as the types of communities that you focus on right now. Talk to us a little bit more about that focus.
Yeah, so we're starting with class A buildings, right? Typically buildings that have, parking structures. And reason being, when it comes to retrofitting and the cost of doing so, parking structures is a lot more economical. Like when you think about garden style communities, quite frankly, like this the technology and what you need to actually retrofit a garden style community just isn't there. Like it is far too expensive to run, you know, feet and feet and feet of, of wire to get to all the different parking spaces. And so we're starting with these class A, buildings, typically anywhere from 200 to 300 apartments. Um, and what we do is we come in and we provide 100% of the capital to retrofit that parking garage and actually prepare it for the future. Meaning, we're not just coming in and putting in 2 or 3 chargers, right, to meet the current demand. We're looking at we're saying, okay, in 5 years from now, in 7 years from now, when 40% of the cars in this garage are electric, how is this building going to provide power? And so what we do is we come in and we actually retrofit. If we're looking at an apartment of 300 parking spaces, we retrofit 100 spaces from transformer to tap. So we're getting the wire in place, we're getting the conduit in place, and then we're putting chargers in for the current demand. So the number of EVs that are currently in the building. And then as new EVs and new EV drivers come to the building, we're just adding chargers. And the philosophy that we're going into this with is again from that customer experience, right, or the tenant experience perspective, which is what's the best possible charging experience for a resident. And when we started kind of exploring this, we said, okay, well, let's look at the people who drive EVs now and ask ourselves, how are these people charging their cars? And as we kind of dug into that, what we learned is that most people who drive EVs now also own a single family home and they have chargers in their garage, right? And so they come home, they plug in, they go about their night, they're making dinner, they're watching Netflix, they go to bed, they wake up and their car is charged and they don't have to think about it. But if you're living in an apartment right now, this isn't a reality, right? The experience is super painful, right? There aren't enough chargers in each building. There's these imposed time limits on how long you can charge. You come home and plug in, you get a text at 10 at night that says, hey, come move your car because the next person, is it needs to come and charge. And so we started asking ourselves, like, okay, well, if this dedicated charging experience or what we call assigned charging experience is ideal, meaning one tenant or one resident to a charger. Why isn't this happening, now? Um, and what we learned there is that the biggest barrier is the cost, right? The cost of retrofitting all of these spaces. It's not the charger, right? Because the charger in comparison is not expensive. It's the fact that you might need to put in a new transformer to be able to power, enough cars at a particular parking structure, right? You're gonna have to call the power company to make sure you can actually get the power there, right? You're having to run, so many feet of wire to get power to particular spaces. And apartment owners that we've talked to just honestly want nothing to do with it, right? It's expensive, it takes a long time, right? If they're investing money in their property, they're not necessarily going to invest it in something that might be, considered risky right now. Because while there are all these tailwinds where the federal government is putting money into EV charging, right? All the car manufacturers are saying, hey, 50% of our fleet, 80% of our fleet will be electric by, 2028, 2030, whatever it is. It's not guaranteed. And so apartment owners aren't super interested in putting that money to work because there's no guarantee of a payout, right? And there's no guarantee that these cars are actually going to be there in a few years. And so that's kind of the bet and the risk that we're taking, right? When we're coming into apartment communities and we're doing this work and we're getting the power to the spots, we're taking that, what we're calling demand risk, right? From the charging
Yeah.
perspective.
Kelsey, thanks for breaking that down so we understand exactly what the challenge is. And it makes a lot of sense, especially for anyone who, owns Class A properties, stays at Class A properties. You will see that. And that's one of the logistical challenges that a lot of people have there. You even see that parking garages, right? If you work at somewhere where there's a parking garage, there's those dedicated spaces. And, I'm sure there's some logistical challenges there as well. Talk to us about, you said something about this is something that you all are kind of taking on the risk. And then you mentioned earlier that 100% of the capital, your firm is kind of bringing to the table to do that. Can you elaborate a little bit more? I want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding what that means.
Yeah, no, I think to to break it down, a little further, to invest in buildings and invest in the electrification, right, and EV charging at buildings, it requires, long-term capital, meaning you're not having to pay it back in 3 years and 5 years. Like, we have access to this long-term capital. We enter long-term agreements with apartment owners, right? So we're talking 15 to 20 years. And we bring the capital, we pay for all of the construction work, we pay for the engineering work necessary. We actually operate the charging experience, right? Making sure that the chargers are up and running, and that tenants have access to this power. And in exchange, right, we have the opportunity to charge a monthly parking fee or a lease fee to tenants. And so that's how we're then able to recapture our capital, pay back our investors, right? And then as part of that monthly lease payment, we actually give a revenue share to apartment owners.
I love it. So just to say it back, you all are bringing the capital to create this infrastructure or retrofit this
Mhm,
infrastructure. You're doing a long-term lease with the apartment owner. So 10, 15, 20 years, you're
mhm.
doing a long-term lease. And the way you monetize it on your end is you're going to be leasing these spots or assigning these spots to the residents who are looking for this. And the bet here or the investment here is that that's going to grow over time.
That's right.
So you may only have, say, 10 cars or 10 residents who are using these spaces when you start out. But as the usage increases, that may go from 10 to 20 to maybe 50, 75 vehicles that are not using this and they're paying a written premium. And then for the owner, it's great because there's a revenue share.
That's right.
So that owner really gets to have the property built in with this infrastructure. It stays kind of with the property. And as the electrification continues to grow, it becomes kind of a revenue center that they get to partake in on the upside as well. So it sounds like a win-win for that property owner because they don't have to do the work.
That's right.
It sounds marketable, at least, right? Even if it doesn't grow, it sounds marketable that you can continue to add more and more EV charging stations per unit and make it assigned to the residents. So, what is the downside for that apartment owner, right? What is the downside for them? I know, obviously, for you all, there's a huge capital expenditure up front, and you're hoping you can make it back, and hopefully you are able to do that. But for that apartment
Mhm.
owner, what is the risk?
That's a good question. As COO of Amperage Capital, there is no risk, right, for the apartment owner. But ultimately, you're entering a long-term agreement, right, with an outside company who's going to manage this, process for you. And it's a couple of things, right? Like if demand does increase, like all of the trends say that it's going to increase, then as the apartment owner, you're maybe missing out on revenue, right? You're missing out on revenue from these EVs that are in your garage and parking and charging, right? But you would also then have to manage the operation, make sure everything's up and running, answer, the call when Kelsey in apartment 3B is trying to charge her car and it's not working. Um, I mean, that to me is probably the biggest, like, opportunity cost. And then the other part is what we focus on from an experience perspective is really trying to fit into whatever the experience is like for the tenant already. So our chargers are activated and deactivated by either like Bluetooth on your phone, or if the resident has like an RFID dongle where they're entering buildings using that, we can actually tie into that as well. And so if you're really keen on owning the entire customer experience yourself, you're then, maybe losing in terms of, okay, you're handing this off and ultimately trusting us to create that experience. Um, so I think those are probably the two main points.
Yeah, and I think most owners are going to look at the cost, right? It's the infrastructure cost, the upfront investment cost, where you don't have that certainty of the ROI. So that's going to
Mhm.
be probably the biggest challenge for most people is, hey, I can build this or invest in this now, but there's no guarantee I'm going to make this back.
That's
Yes, the trends are pointing in that direction, but why do it now? Why not just wait until it's very clear that this is where the market is? So I think that's the trade-off as well for a lot of people. In this case, you kind of get some upside without the downside risk, but yeah, maybe you are capping that upside potential. Speaking of kind of that investment, ballpark, what does this cost to implement? Right? I mean, we're talking $5,000. Is this a six-figure investment? What does it take to implement and kind of retrofit one of these EV charging stations?
Yeah, so we look at it right at scale, and the whole idea kind of with the solution we're coming in with is because we're doing this at scale, we get economies of scale on equipment and the material costs and construction costs and all of that. So when we're looking at a building that's say 300 units and or 300 parking spaces and we're retrofitting 100 spaces, the number is around $250,000, right? And that includes the conduit, the wiring, a transformer, which is almost certainly needed because there are 0 buildings right now that have enough power available to power, you know, 100 EV chargers in a particular garage. And so it's everything that goes into that, to make these assigned charging spaces possible.
There you go. No, I appreciate you sharing that. So around $250,000 for about 100 spaces, just a rough estimate of what you may be looking at, and that's an investment that you and your team kind of take. That owner doesn't have to worry about that investment, and then there's some sort of revenue share on the back end. So makes a lot of sense for the business model that you have, but also from the owner's perspective as well. So as you kind of look forward, we talked about kind of the growth in this space. And we talked about, kind of the alternatives as well, right? Charging at grocery store, wherever
Mhm.
else, your options are. How do you kind of see this playing out and moving more mainstream? So right now, I know you're only at Class A or Class A properties, But at some point, if the trajectory is to continue down this pathway, this will need to be rolled out to Class B properties and maybe more common in the marketplace as well. So, talk to us a little bit more about what you foresee in the future there.
Yeah. So, like you mentioned, starting with Class A properties, but a majority of properties in the US are not kind of in our investment kind of profile right now.
Hmm.
And they can't be based on the technology that's actually available, right? And being able to get the power there. But in the background, we're researching and we're talking to, tens of different companies that are thinking about that future power need, right? So we're talking to companies that have generators that are generating power on site for things like grocery stores right now using natural gas, right? And alternative fuels. We're talking to companies that are creating rackable transformers. So instead of coming and having to put in this giant transformer to then bring power in, you can actually put these transformers in the garage, right? In a garage or in a building. And just as you need more power, it's another thing that I physically could come in and put into the garage, right? We're tracking different companies who are focused on solar and battery, right? Because in kind of our agreements with these apartment communities, we're entering this long-term agreement to provide EV charging. We're also entering an agreement to actually provide distributed energy resources over the long term, meaning we're going to get 3 years from now. We might have 40, 50 chargers in the garage. And actually, to power those chargers, we're going to do it using solar to battery to charger, or we're going to do it using, power from the grid. Like in Texas and in a lot of places, you actually get free nights and weekends. And that's when electricity companies will actually vent power, like their excess power. So we would actually suck that power into a battery, store it, and then we can deliver that to the chargers and we can deliver that actually to the building, right? And so with these advancements that are coming, they're not quite ready yet, right? We're going to be able to address the properties that we're addressing now, but then we're going to be able to address those properties in the future that we can't address in a cost effective way right now.
Yeah, and I think it's important too because for many listeners, this may not be as relevant today, right? You're like, oh, I invest in Class C apartment buildings. I invest in 50 to 100 units, or 10 to 20, whatever it is. So maybe this isn't relevant today, but I think it's still really important to pay attention to what's happening and what could be on the horizon because it could give you a competitive advantage, especially when the technology does match up with kind of what's available in the marketplace. So it's good to understand where things are headed, where people are going, because this is going to be the future in some capacity. So it's important to pay attention, just understand at least what's happening, how, some of these different communities are already incorporating, already planning for it, and making adjustments to what's going forward here. We're talking about energy, right? We're talking about EVs, but energy in general is really a big push here, especially in the US more recently, recently being over the last, 10, 15 years. And I know part of the way they're encouraging companies and encouraging investors to get behind this is through tax breaks or tax credits. Talk to us a little bit about the tax credits or the tax breaks or the programs that exist for kind of these EV stations that are being implemented.
Yeah, so the programs that are out there for the most part are focused on these public charging stations, right? I think in the last month and last couple of weeks, even more and more programs are coming out. And what those are doing is um, they're really trying to recreate this gas station model, right? And they're trying to say, hey, public, FYI, go get an EV, don't worry, you can charge it. Look, there's a charging station here and there's a charging station there and one over there, right? And they're making this very big effort to push these public charging stations, and specifically they're called DC fast chargers that can actually charge your car in 30 to 40 minutes. And so they're making the push to really get this technology out there. And that's where a lot of the government money, that's where it's being funneled. And it's focused on that kind of charging experience. But what we know as EV drivers and just from surveys and different kind of research projects that have gone around, we know that 80% of people charge at home. And so when it comes to getting charging stations into your multifamily, building, right? What I would say is if you have a building that's close to something like a shopping center or a popular destination where people tend to dwell, spending the money and putting in a level 3 DC fast charger might make sense. Like it's going to take minimum $150,000 of infrastructure work in most places to get one of those chargers in, and then another 30 to 50,000 to actually buy the charger. But if you have enough people going through there because you're close to a Trader Joe's, for example, right? Then you're going to have people using that and you'll be able to actually make up your investment. And you'll potentially be able to apply for these, grants that will pay for a lot of that work. And so that makes total sense. What the grants aren't doing for the most part is they're not focusing on home charging. And they're not focusing on what's called level 2 charging, which is where, our focus is, right? It's this idea that it's okay that it takes 8 to 10 hours to charge my car for a couple of reasons, right? In each of those hours, I get 15 to 20 miles added to my car, right, with a level 2 charger. And on average, people in the United States only drive about 40 miles a day. So really, it's going to take 2 hours to recharge your car. But if you have to fill it from 0 to 100%, then overnight is actually going to be just fine. It's going to work for you. You're off doing other things. It doesn't matter. And to that end, there are very few programs from a funding perspective that are focused on funding this type of infrastructure. And that's where, the idea for Amperage came up, which is that to address this problem in commercial buildings, so, even including like office buildings and that kind of stuff, is going to take private capital. And it's going to take private capital that we call long-term capital that can be paid back over a long period of time. And for those private investors to be interested in it, the right business model needs to be built for this type of experience. And the business models that are out there for charging right now just don't make sense, and they're not working for the charging companies, they're not working for apartment owners, right? It's this idea that I'm going to charge a premium on the kilowatt hour. I plug in, maybe I as the end user pay 32 cents per kilowatt, and then 20 cents per kilowatt goes to the apartment owner. Well, there just aren't enough cars right now. There's not a high enough utilization to actually get paid back on any investment that you're putting into that. And so, when we think about kind of how we're structuring things from a business model standpoint, we had to set it up in a way that was actually attractive for these private investors to want to come in and put that money in, because federal government, state government, local government isn't putting money there. Like they're not interested in it right now.
I think this conversation is doing a couple things, right? I think one, it's setting I don't want to say the groundwork, but I think people really need to understand just how important electric vehicles are being positioned for the future, and how we're going to need to adapt and at least understand how to incorporate this moving forward, and then how you can help, and how your firm can help those Class A apartment investors, and I think in the future, maybe more Class B and other type of investors as well. I want to switch gears just a little bit for that
Sure.
person who maybe has a 4 unit, or maybe just a single family house, and maybe they do have a resident who has an electric vehicle, or maybe they think this is a way to stand out in the marketplace. What would it look like? I don't know what the costs are, and maybe you do, maybe you don't know, but
Yeah.
what does it look like if someone just wanted to install kind of a home electric charging station or something like that, as opposed to, retrofitting an entire parking garage.
Yeah, absolutely. I just did this. So a home charging station, the actual hardware is going to cost anywhere from $500 to $600. So it's not this super intense, super expensive piece of equipment. And then depending on how much power is actually available on your breaker panel, you might need to add a sub panel, right? There might need to be some work there, which I can tell you I had to add a sub panel. So all in the electrician work to add the sub panel, install the charger, right? That came to about 1,500. And then the charger on top of that was $600. So you're looking at around $2,000, right, to get this charger installed in just a single family home. And then I actually also have a couple of rental properties, right? So if I had tenants who had an EV, wanted to have charging it at their house, and ultimately it's an upgrade to my infrastructure. So if I was so obliged, I would go ahead and do that. And really the conversation would be, okay, so this is what it means for your rent, right? So if it costs, call it $2,000, I would spread that out over, maybe 5 years, just to make it fair, because maybe the next person who, comes into the house also has an EV. I would spread that cost out over 5 years, and it would just be an increase to rent, because you've now built out the infrastructure, you've put in the charger, and you've made it possible for that person to charge their car at home. And so it's this added benefit, right, of your property and of renting from you.
Yeah, it's another amenity, and if you can obviously build or bill for your utilities directly to the resident, then that part's covered. So now it's
Mhm.
just really the infrastructure cost. If you're covering those utility costs, and obviously you may want to figure out another model there to kind of manage that. But
Yeah.
it's definitely something I think we need to be thinking about, because at the end of the day, it's an amenity, and you're going to attract people who are willing to pay a premium, willing to, if you can go out there and get an EV vehicle, you're open to paying a premium for that. So it just is something for you to consider if you are catering to those electric vehicle drivers. If folks want to learn more, they can go to your website, amperagecapital.com. That's AMPERAGE capital.com. So we'll make sure we link to that in our show notes. Right now, we're going to go on to our round of insights. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Give me a failure or an apparent failure that sets you up for later success.
Yeah, so I had my heart set on business school when I was in like my mid 20s. I had just spent a year as the GM of the India office of the startup where I was working. I had excellent letters of recommendation from, people who I thought were the right people to give those, and I felt like this was the next step. So I had applied to Stanford and I applied to Harvard, just those two. And I didn't even get an interview. Nothing. Like I was crushed. But what happened, right after that was my next role at a new company was an operations role. And I learned more there than I thought possible. Kind of over my time, I headed up almost every department in the company at one point or another. I built an international supply chain, actually created a financial model that we use to manage the business and like raise millions of dollars, and all things that I had never done before. And kind of at the end of that experience, I looked back, and just having that real world experience was irreplaceable. And the only reason I got there was because I, didn't get into business school.
I love it.
And so, yeah, it was sad at the time. And then a few years later, I was lucky in a way.
Give me a digital or mobile resource you recommend for your business.
Yeah, Chat GPT. So there's tons of hype around AI technology, right? And there's so much you can do with it. But for me, it's the best research tool out there. I don't ask it super complex things, but if it can give me a template for a social media campaign and that shaves a few hours of thinking from my list, like that's huge.
Give me the book you've recommended or gifted the most in the last year.
Measure What Matters. So it's a book focused on OKRs, which are objectives and key results. And I kind of live my life by OKRs. I set personal and professional OKRs every year. I break it down by quarter. And so I think I've given copies of that to probably 2 or 3 people in the last month.
There you go. Love that. Give me a daily habit that helps you stay focused on your goals.
Yeah. Exercise. So we chatted out before. I was a pretty serious water polo player all the way through college, so it was just built into my routine. And now I go to F45 almost every morning, and I do the early class. So just getting up and moving my body is key. And if I don't do that, then I feel sluggish, and I'm just honestly not very nice for the rest of the day. But actually, I think it's more than exercise. It's really scheduling it in. So probably scheduling is the habit that's the most important. Like, people see my calendar and they think I'm a little bit nuts because I have everything dialed in, like workout time, shower, meetings, when I take my dog for a walk. But having it kind of dialed in just lets me kind of focus on what I have to do now, because I don't have to think about, whatever's coming next.
Give me your number one insight for EV investing.
For EV investing, I mean, it's focused on that experience, right? Because whether you're investing in EV charging or buying an apartment building, right? It's how does that experience make the end user feel, right? So if it's a potential apartment building purchase, I was asked, what's it like to be a tenant there, and how much will I have to invest to actually make this a great place where people want to live? Because if it's not a great place to live, then you're going to be challenged to actually find tenants who want to live there, right? And then retain those tenants.
All right, let's lighten the mood a little bit. You are in the DFW area, so
Yeah.
give us your favorite place to grab a bite to eat.
Yeah, so I live in Southlake, in Texas, and I've actually been pleasantly surprised by the food scene. But I'm also more of a fast casual type of diner. I'm not super fancy. And so there's recently a velvet taco that was put in near me. And the concept is super simple. I actually had an opportunity to meet one of the co-founders a few months back. And what he said was he wanted to put the different flavors of the world in a handheld dish. And it's super tasty. So everything on their menu is a taco for the main stuff, right? And it's just different flavors. So their most popular taco is a chicken tikka taco. It's their best seller across all of their stores. And then they have like a Korean fried rice taco and all these different flavors that you wouldn't normally find in a tortilla. And it's amazing. And it's a chain, but it's fairly small. It started in Dallas, so it feels a little bit kind of local in that way.
I love it. We'll link to that in our notes here, and we'll definitely have to check that out the next time we are in the DFW market, and we'll have to see exactly where they're at. So maybe they're closer to us now, so we'll check that out. Kelsey, this has been really great. I'm looking at my notes here, and I want to, thank you for being a guest on the show. You talked about really just kind of the changing landscape of EV vehicles, and it's something that, again, maybe people aren't thinking about it. This show is certainly more about multifamily and real estate investing, not necessarily about cars. But I think the notion here of the changing landscape is important, particularly in that Class A area where you are looking to cater more towards that, luxury type of resident. And this is certainly a big thing. More importantly, 20% of the vehicles sold last year in California were EV vehicles. We are expecting that many firms are going to have the majority of their vehicle fleet being EV vehicles by 2030. I think GM has stated that all of their vehicles will be EVs by 2035. So this is something that is going to impact us one way or the other. It's just a matter of how do we prepare as real estate investors. So if you are looking to learn more, If this is a fit for what you're looking for, be sure to reach out to Kelsey and her team at amperagecapital.com. That's AMPERAGE capital.com. I want to thank you again for being a guest today and coming on the show. We look forward to staying in touch with you, and I hope you have a great day.
Awesome. Thanks, John. You too.